Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show appearing here on Facebook Live and the only place where Shaka answers your questions. I'm Jackson Vunganyi, host of Upfront. I'm sitting in for Paul Ndiho, and here with me is Shaka Sally, the man himself. Shaka, it's such a pleasure to have you on set again. How are you doing today?
I am doing hugely terrific.
I look forward
Jackson.
to having a good conversation with you on various issues, mostly questions that have been sent in by your followers and listeners on your various platforms. So Shaka, let's start off with some of the breaking news or the news of the week here in the USA. The death of George H.W. Bush, the 41st president of the USA. He passed away last Friday. He's lying in the state capitol here in the Rotunda. People paying their respects, including President Trump. Let's talk about his significance and legacy, or what they call as a complicated legacy in regards to Africa. You covered him, or you covered his administration as a journalist, as a young journalist in the late 80s or early 90s, so to say. What do you see as the legacy of George H.W. Bush in as far as Africa is concerned?
First of all, I think to put it in context, frankly, we should point out the fact that here was what the military would say. Here was an officer and a gentleman, very principled, a man who believed in institutions, a man who believed in multilateralism, especially the fact that he actually believed in the fact that the United Nations could indeed do its job and make a difference to the world. And he was able to know that because he actually served as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations at one time. This is a man who, when Somalia was in trouble, in tatters and what have you, he came up with this idea of Operation Restore Hope. This, by the way, at a time when he was in fact a president, a lame duck president, who had just lost an election. But he actually did that to Somalia. It may not have worked in the short term, of course, as we later found out, but the fact that he was able to do that, you really have to give him credit. You also have to remember that the end of apartheid South Africa, as a matter of fact, ended on his watch. And if you went beyond Africa, you go to Berlin, the Berlin Conference. It collapsed on his watch. And this is a man...
So all these landmark events in history happened when he was president?
When he was president, and the other good thing about him is that he probably, arguably, was one of the few individuals, frankly, that had actually been prepared to be president of any country, if you look at his background.
Based on his foreign policy credentials. Sorry, for his background, like you said, he was an ambassador. He served as
ambassador to China, ambassador to the United Nations. He was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. He was also head of the Republican Party. And by the way, he was also a son of a Senator Prescott Bush.
Yes. Would you say he was more effective?
He was also, by the way, vice president.
Yes, he was also, he served also as vice president. Would you say he was more effective in his foreign policy than he was locally? You were living here in the U.S. at the time of his presidency. There's
no question about it. But then again, when you look at the presidency of the United States, that happens to be probably the only area, frankly, where presidents have an opportunity to make a difference. Because when it comes to domestic policies, that one is really involves a lot of people, including Capitol Hill and what have you, governors and you name it. This is a man who, beyond being, of course, vice president, and therefore being the president of the Senate, this is a man who had been a congressman from Texas. This is a man who had been a successful business person dealing with oil in Texas and all that kind of stuff. He's a man who went to some of the best schools around, including, of course, Yale.
Yale, yes.
So this is a man who some would have said that was blue-blooded, and he delivered. Unfortunately, because he probably was a one-term president, a lot of people tend not to give him credit, really. But when you look at him, in fact, I would agree with those who say that he was perhaps, when you look at the history of the United States, he was perhaps the best president, or the best one-term president, or the best president that served only one term.
Do you think history is going to remember him differently?
I think so. I think that history is going to put him in context because he had humility. He had prudence. He was always talking about prudence.
So something that people said American politics kind of lacks these days.
Precisely. But he had that humility. You know, when the Berlin Wall fell, given the fact that his predecessor, President Ronald Reagan, had actually talked about how Gorbachev, the new man in Moscow at that time, should tear that wall. JFK, perhaps the most celebrated president in modern history, very handsome, from a rich background, intellectual and what have you, and exposed. He had gone to Berlin and made a big speech, Ich bin Berliner, you know, that kind of stuff.
I am a Berliner.
I'm a Berliner.
Yes. So all these presidents that came before him, this was a battle they fought, but it was won on his watch.
On his watch. And he had actually been urged and persuaded to go to Berlin, in fact, personally, so that he could dance.
Yeah, he could celebrate.
Yes.
And he passed on that opportunity.
This is a man who had humility. He really didn't have much of an ego because he said, you know what, this moment belongs to the Germans, the German people.
Absolutely. That says a lot about him.
And he managed, by the way, very, very well, frankly, the consequences of the falling or the collapse of the wall of Berlin. Because guess what? Most of the Eastern European countries are now, in a sense, democratic.
So as an American president, in terms of what he did for the country and, you know, elevating the status of the country globally, he was quite effective.
He was
even though it was not very much felt locally. Let's move to the continent. Our listeners, your listeners and viewers have sent us a couple of questions, mostly regarding the DRC. We know that the DRC is about to have an election this month, I believe, one of a very important election, which will see the first time, I think, a country is going through a transition, a peaceful transition. Obviously, there's some issues. We were talking about yesterday a report that showed that clashes in the eastern part of Congo, 18 people died, many continue to die. We have a question from Bahe Muka from Uganda. He asks, can the DRC become democratic before the rich minerals are exhausted by the foreigners? But before we get to his question, my question to you is that, do you see the events that are happening in the Congo right now, in terms of some of the conflict areas, like eastern part of Congo? Do you see that putting a blotch on the elections or hampering the elections?
I think at the end of the day, Jackson, frankly, it is up to the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo what they really want to see happen in their country. The people of the DRC have suffered a lot from the 60s when they won this political flag independence from the Belgians. You had Patrice Emery Lumumba as the first prime minister, a man, frankly, who is worshipped, who is a hero. Even when you go back to Kinshasa, he is a hero. But unfortunately, his tenure was short-lived. He was a victim of the Cold War. And he ended up dying in a very short time without delivering the promises that he had actually pledged to his people. I think it is very high time, sincerely, for the leaders of the DRC at every level to see it in their hearts, in their deepest, better part of their Congolese hearts and soul, to finally deliver what I would characterize as social, economic, political justice to all the Congolese.
Right. If you're just joining us, thank you very much. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. I'm in for Paul Diho. This is Shaka Extra Time with Shaka Sali himself. This platform where you get to ask Shaka all the burning questions about what is happening on the African continent. We're still talking about the DRC. This young person from Uganda was asking about whether you see the DRC ever becoming democratic before the minerals exhausted by the foreigners, talking about the exploitation of minerals by foreigners in the DRC. But I guess a much more pertinent question comes from Kamaratu David, who asks, will President Kabila ensure that his ally is elected? And why does the West accept these obviously unfair elections?
First of all, when you look at the first part of the question, whether I think that Kabila would, in a sense, help a man that he would like to succeed him actually win the election. Obviously, that is his duty, isn't it? They belong to the same party. He obviously would like to be succeeded with someone with whom they have views on the same page.
Right.
And why not? So if
and
he
some are
did
saying that
that,
his hand-picked successor
yes,
would be favorable to his,
Yeah, that's what is expected of him. The alternative would obviously be disastrous as far as he and his supporters are concerned. But let's hope that at the end of the day, under the watch of Joseph Kabila, at least for the first time in the history of his country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. At one time it was Zaire, according to Mobutu Sese Seko Wazabanga.
Kukungwendu Wazabanga.
That is correct. He liberated himself from the slave name of Joseph Desire. Joseph Desire Mobutu.
Yeah.
You know, at one time he is obviously remembered for having introduced some very significant authenticity, a policy of being very Congolese, very African, and all that kind of stuff. And
even though he maintained mansions in these Western capitals.
You could see some of those aspects reflected in his attire, for example.
Right, absolutely, the way he
used to dress.
Yeah.
You could see that reflected in the religious aspect of, is it Kimbuguism? You know, that kind of stuff. But when it came to the rest of things to do with economy and what have you, this man was not really fair. This man did not seem to really even care about the people.
Do you think that the ghost of Mobutu looms large over this transition, impending transition in the DRC?
As a matter of fact, a lot of people have written to suggest that nothing very much has really ever changed since the demise of Mobutu Sese Seko Wazabanga. As a matter of fact, there was at one time in the 1980s, there was a research group which went to the then Zaire and interviewed people. These are very ordinary urban peasants in Kinshasa, in Lubumbashi, in different places like Goma and what have you. They were asking them, what did they think about independence? And most of them actually responded that they were in fact wondering when this thing called independence is going to come to an end. The reason, Jackson, was very simple, because they argued that before this thing called independence came about, you could go to a neighborhood and find salt in a store.
There were good times.
Yeah, you could find soap and what have you.
But independence really did not bring any prosperity. It took away their salt from the neighbors. So the question then is that, is it in the best interests of do you think that Kabila will allow a free and fair democratic election in the country? And like this young man asks Kamaratu David, why does the West accept these obviously unfair elections. Obviously, we don't know whether they will be unfair or not because we have not had elections as yet. But I guess just to add on to that, Shaka, another question, because we had a lot of DRC questions here, and then we can probably lump them together. Hakumoto MC Mary Clemens asks, how can the international community help the Congolese elections?
But Jackson, the first part of your question, first of all, almost presupposes, frankly, that the Congo is not a sovereign territory, is not a country. The Congo is a country. Because the question almost suggests or implies that, in fact, it is like a real estate or a farm belonging to one Joseph Kabila. It does not belong to Joseph Kabila. It belongs to the more than 70 million people who call DRC home.
Right. But
I would suppose that at least in theory, they have equal shares in that corporation called the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
They have a say in what happens in the Congo.
And in fact, they should.
And they should demand that there be fair and transparent elections.
Fair, free, credible, transparent, and verifiable elections.
Right.
So that they can, in fact, have an election whose results reflect the will of their people,
and they
not the individual in Kinshasa.
Right, and most importantly, not to wait for the international community to come and help.
Precisely, precisely.
Yeah.
The international community can only help, for example, if it sends some, some people to observe and make sure that they are not only observing really, but in fact they are influencing or helping to influence the trend and they are telling the authorities in power at this point in time that you have to make sure that you deliver, at least for once in your history, an election, frankly, that is accepted across the board.
By international standards.
Precisely.
This is Shaka Extra Time with Shaka Sali. My name is Jackson Vonganyi. Okay, so we know that one of the powers that is interested in seeing free and fair elections in the DRC is China. They have a lot of interest, economic interest, and obviously, so the question is, do they want to see a free and fair election in the DRC? Do they want to see a situation that leads to them being able to do business on the continent in general? And so that segues into the question coming from Monsaka Lutenda, who asks, Shaka, what do you think about the Sino-African relationship? Is it mutually beneficial?
Well, I think that it ought to be mutually beneficial. But from where I stand and what I look at least so far, it does not look like that. It looks like tilted in the really interests, more in the interests of China. And I think part of the reason, frankly, is not because the Chinese don't want it that way, to have it that way. Of course, the Chinese have no choice but obviously to make sure that they promote what they consider to be their vital national security interests. That is what their job is. So what about the Africans themselves? It is up to the African leaders, sincerely. And I think the African leaders today, Jackson, more than at any one time before, they have a great opportunity because they can actually choose. They can choose from the West, they can choose from the Chinese, they can choose from the Indians, they can choose from the Turkish, they can choose from the Brazilians, the emerging markets and all that kind of stuff, so that they can actually get the best bargain for their people.
Right.
But unfortunately, most of them, what they actually go for, sometimes, I characterize some of them as patriotic to their stomachs. The stomachs of their families, the stomachs of their friends, not society, not the people of their country. And so that is very simple because they can get 10% and what have you. But I think it is high time, sincerely, that the African leaders begin seriously looking at issues, looking at answers that reflect the concerns of the vast majority of their people.
Right.
Because let's face it, most of the African countries, right now as we talk, Jackson, the population is largely made up of very young people.
Right. Africa is the youngest continent right now.
Precisely.
Over 60% are below the age of 22 or 24.
Young people that have no jobs, young people that have no skills, young people that are actually born at a time when it is much easier than our generations and before to be exposed, to know what is happening in the region and beyond.
Access to information.
Of social media and all that kind of stuff. And so you really have to make sure that you meet the concerns of these people, because if you do not meet the concerns of these people, at one time, you're going to actually have to deal with huge uprisings, which will probably translate into revolutions, just like the way we used to read about the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks.
Right. I mean, we don't need to redefine history. No. We can look at North Africa a couple of years ago.
Precisely.
The Jasmine Revolution. Okay, so Shaka, one of the most persistent problems on the continent, obviously, youth unemployment, which we see, which has been blamed for the migration on, people dying as they cross the Mediterranean, going to Europe. Today, a story broke that 15 migrants were reportedly killed or died off a boat off the Libyan coast. How can the continent or African governments deal with the issue of migration?
First of all, you have to look at or identify the fundamental root causes that are responsible for these forces that push and the forces that pull. These kids or these people are trying to cross the Mediterranean, and some of them are doing the dying for all of us and what have you, obviously because they live or exist in a situation of hopelessness. They do not see really tomorrow, but they realize that some of the people whom they know who had crossed the Mediterranean at one time or another, they seem to be well off. They seem to be sending some remittances and what have you and making a difference in their neighborhoods.
Right.
And so African leaders, sincerely, they have to be able to harness their resources, because Africa is not poor because it has no wealth. No, on the contrary. Africa, in fact, is probably one of the wealthiest parts
of
the continent.
Right.
If you talk about agriculture, where is the largest, fertile land, in fact, to cultivate, which could actually be the world's bread basket? Africa.
Mineral resources.
If you look at mineral resources, you look at coltan, for example, which is used in
powering our cell phones,
laptops, and so many other things. Where does it come from, for the most part? Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo.
And so who's benefiting from it then?
Precisely. If you walk, for example, in New York City, in Manhattan, on Park Avenue, you look at diamonds, at gold, necklaces and what have you, and stuff like that. People who are looking so beautiful, wearing these, beautiful
fancy
ornaments and what have you.
Yes.
Where do they come from? They come from Mbujimai, for example. I have been to Mbujimai. You cannot believe, Jackson, that in Mbujimai, which is almost the epicenter of diamonds in the world, in Mbujimai there exists an economy based on sweet potatoes, which I grew up on in Kabale, southwestern Uganda. Why?
And yet they're exporting diamonds.
Precisely. Because the African leaders are not doing their part. They have to do their part.
To harness these resources.
When I was growing up, Jackson, I used to hear politicians and leaders talking about how Africa produces what it does not consume and consumes what it does not produce.
Which makes sense that they spend billions of dollars importing food.
Which is very true. But then, why can't they fix that?
Right.
Those contradictions.
So
these modern leaders talk about we need to add value. We need to add value. But they end up talking the talk When are they going to walk that talk?
Right.
So that Africans and their people can begin to walk the walk.
So there's a bit of a leadership
and
vacuum on the continent.
Yes.
Right. Begin to swag. I like that.
Yeah.
Shaka Sally here on Shaka Live. So Shaka, what are you going to talk about tomorrow on the show on Straight Talk Africa? Actually,
tomorrow we're talking about politics. Because politics is really the oxygen of everything. We're going to talk about the role of opposition political parties, if any, and also find out, by the way, if an ordinary African in most countries on the African continent have a right to own an opinion that may be different from the ruling party or government of the day.
Right. So basically, the question you'll be asking is that do you feel like you have the right to speak your mind?
Most people say so far that from what we have seen actually that they do not. In fact, they live under fear because they are intimidated. Because let's face it, part of the reason, in fact, Africa is not developed is precisely because the so-called leaders in Africa on all levels do not consult, do not involve their own people in the issues of development. And yet that development is actually meant to be for their benefit.
For the people.
But you have individuals, for example, who basically wake up and decide that you need a road from A to B. It doesn't matter where it is going to go through, whether they are going to take it through somebody's house and destroy it and all that kind of stuff, or whether those people, in fact, what they need is a dispensary, is a health care center, is a hospital, is a sick bay. So we need to be able to involve our people in some of these major decisions that are going to affect them. That is the only way that Africa can actually develop, can leapfrog. Most of these countries that are developed, including this one that we are actually living in, there is the issue of public opinion. And public opinion is very, very important.
Key.
Very key.
The people need get to speak out on issues that actually affect them without fear that there will be repercussions, including for them being killed.
Precisely. And that does not happen, frankly, because this society is altruistic. No. This society happens to listen to other people because it is a society of laws.
Right.
It is a society that respects everybody because most people who decide who becomes president, the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, every 4 years, or a senator or a congressman, is through voting. And the votes here are votes whose results reflect the will of the voter.
Right.
But unfortunately, in most African countries, when you talk about elections and what have you, you are usually talking about a facade. Because these are selections. The guy who has the power essentially controls everything to such an extent that, in fact, he is very close to even controlling oxygen, which everybody needs to access in order to be alive.
To be alive. That is sad. But most importantly, I guess your message is that people need to speak out to demand. Nobody gets those things for free.
But that has to change, especially with the changing demographics.
Absolutely.
The young people have to change that.
Need to speak out, and that's something that we always talk about on my show on Upfront. And we want to thank Shaka Sally, the great Shaka Sally, and thank you, all of you, for joining us here on Shaka Extra Time. Remember to check out our Facebook page, like, share, subscribe, and we'll catch you next time right here on Shaka Extra Time. Shaka, it was such a pleasure talking to you.
You're most welcome. I just forgot to attribute, for example, a very important saying by